Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Christian Democracy, where we talk about Catholic social teaching in the light of contemporary affairs. My name is Jack Quirk. We begin with a prayer. Father, let us be the hands that bring food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, welcome to the strangers, clothing to the naked, care for the sick, and comfort to the prisoners. May everything that is said here be in furtherance of these things, and of your truth and love, through Christ our Lord. St. Joseph the Worker, pray for us. Pray. My guest tonight is Elias Crim. He is the founder of Solidarity Hall. He's a native Texan. He spent a few years studying classics and medieval Italian at the University of California, Berkeley. And then after that, he was involved with financial journalism in the Chicago area. He has written for the American Scholar, the American Conservative, and the Chicago Observer. He is the co-author of a textbook on character education. He briefly published something called The Armchair Historian. He has 3 teenage daughters, and he and his wife and his family live in Valparaiso, Indiana. And we are fortunate to have him here with us tonight. If you spend any time within a certain sector of the internet, you certainly are familiar with Solidarity Hall, which he is now the publisher of. And but perhaps for those of us who aren't familiar with it, Elias, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Solidarity Hall, what it is, and how it was conceived.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jack, and thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Before we went on the air here, I just did a quick check to remind myself exactly when I got this brainwave of creating Solidarity Hall. It's a long time ago. It was actually late 2010, and I'll back up just a little bit and say that prior to that, I would describe myself as a pretty sturdy John Paul II Catholic. I came into the church in '86, middle-aged convert from Southern Baptist denomination of my childhood. And I stayed with that probably until, I don't know, I guess somewhere around 2006, 2008. It was right around the crash that I got very interested in Catholic social teachings, more or less through reading Chesterton. I have kind of a literary bent, so I read some Chesterton. G.K.
Yeah. Chesterton.
Yeah, Chesterton and his great friend Hilaire Belloc. And they had these curious, interesting ideas about something called distributism. And I figured out that what they were talking about was solving the great problem of capitalism, which is that there are not enough capitalists. There are not enough people that own things, own their own livelihood. And I thought, well, yeah, that's exactly, how come we can't? I thought that was supposed to happen by now,
Well, I don't think that the intent of the prevailing economic system is that at all, Elias.
No, it isn't.
But
Some of us are
ahead.
Slow learners, though.
Oh, I see.
So I started thinking about that. Well, here's the amazing thing, though. I'm looking at the newspaper or reading online, and I see that this guy, David Cameron, has just been elected in England, in the UK. And one of his moves is to hire an advisor who turns out to be a theologian. And I thought, a theologian, that is a sign of desperation, if I've ever heard one, So who's this theologian? It's this guy named Philip Blond. And Blond is kind of an advocate for an approach called The Big Society. And his particular political flavor is something called Red Toryism, which is a combination of kind of a social conservatism with a very red kind of economics. And I thought, oh, this is curiouser and curiouser, you know. So I started reading up on this guy. I got a copy of his book, Red Tory, which was fantastic. And then I saw he was coming to the States. He was coming to speak at Georgetown. So I checked in with somebody at Georgetown, and I said, I'm very interested in this guy, and he seems to have an organization in London, and they do interesting kind of policy stuff, public policy stuff. I wonder if he would like an American branch. So some wheels started turning. Next thing I know, this is pretty crazy. Next thing I know, I fly out to D.C. Philip Blond comes to Georgetown to speak. And I and a couple of other guys, we actually had a meeting with Paul Ryan.
Yeah.
It was just before Romney nominated him for VP. So his whole life was about to go upside down. But he had 10 minutes for Philip Blond. And I got a little inside look, just very quickly, at what it is like to call on a Capitol Hill big shot. And what it is you're ushered in, and you sit down, people shake hands, you trade cards, and then you say why you came. And the guy sits there and he goes, and there's a staff guy, and he's making a couple of notes. And that's the end of the meeting. And you shake hands, and everybody smiles, and then you just take off. And basically, that's it. Nothing happens.
No,
it's it's kind of like a Japanese tea ceremony or something. It's purely for show.
Did you bring a check?
Well, that part. Now, see, maybe that's why the meeting was only 10 minutes. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, come on.
So,
I mean, you went to Berkeley.
We just didn't know how to work this, right? So we shook a lot of hands, and Blonde, had some interest. We met Bill Kristol. It was ridiculous. So anyway,
I was chased off Paul Ryan's lawn one time.
Excellent.
But anyway, that's another story.
That's another story.
Yeah.
So we thought we were getting somewhere, but it turns out, I mean, the short version is, we realized that organizing a nonprofit and doing a knockoff of a group in the UK, all of that, we just decided it really wasn't such a great idea, that maybe the world did not need one more Washington-based think tank, policy tank. And instead, actually, several of my friends said, we need to just do some reading and blogging and thinking, don't we, before we start recommending policy? I mean, do we want to, are we like policy wonks and we want to crunch data, or what are we trying to do? So I agreed. We needed to create a blog and think about, society and community building and some sort of new third way economics. But we didn't need to rush into business because we wouldn't have known really what to do. So we just started reading and blogging. Solidarity Hall launched, I guess it would have been in maybe late 2012. So we dropped the think tank and decided just to create a thinker space, as we called it. And a bunch of great, mostly kind of younger writers showed up. And I'll mention people like Mark Gordon and Susanna Black and Daniel Schwent and Mike Stafford and Grace Potts. And there were some wonderful people that I had never heard of before, never run into. But the great thing about Solidarity Hall was that we connected, and we have now occasionally been able to meet up together. And we have been blogging and writing about a combination of things, most of it having to do with community building, distributism, third way approaches, all of it sort of Catholic flavored, but very much trying to figure out, what was Caritas and Veritate, that encyclical from Benedict, what was that about? What was he trying to say, So this is even before Pope Francis showed up. We were trying to figure out how do we get this show on the road in terms of institutions and the economy and the grassroots. So we read and talked and did some publishing. We published a book called Radically Catholic in the Age of Francis. This is after He had.
I remember that. I do.
You're in there.
Yeah, you're going to have to say that again because I didn't hear it. I actually, I actually snuck it in there. I had to.
You didn't? No.
I had to pay somebody.
We found you, or you found us, and you were right in there. We figured we needed to kind of, in a way, kind of explain Pope Francis to an American audience because we could see. Although we not only got him, we liked him a lot, we could see that a lot of people just could not figure out what is this guy talking about? What are these economic ideas he's throwing out? So partly the anthology was to clarify a little bit of what he was up to, and there were some wonderful essays from people like John Maddai and Audrey Davis and several others. We had maybe 12, 15 people in there. So that was fun to do, a good project. That was, I believe, in 2014. So we occasionally think about even updating that and creating a new edition of it. But I reflecting back on that volume. I remember Daniel Schwint was the editor of it, and I remember he was telling me that we want something personal about you, right? And that was very challenging because I hadn't engaged in any self-reflection for like upwards of 40 years. Oh. Must have been painful.
No, it
was great. It came out very nicely. Well, we wanted to make it a little more readable. But we did not want to create a bunch of theological essays, even though some of it gets a little theological, naturally. But we tried to kind of cover the waterfront. So there's a lot of more informal kind of writing, which we think made the book more accessible.
Right. Well, the articles are all really good. You know. So I really, if I do say so myself, I guess that's tooting my own horn to a certain extent. Although I have only one article in there, no, you've got a number of really excellent writers in there, and some of whom you mentioned, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was a fun project. Mm-hmm. So we haven't really published anything since then. We've been actually a little quiet until very recently. Mostly just because I've been busy. It is a little bit of a one-man band with a bunch of volunteers, Mm-hmm. We did do a kind of sponsored project, the sponsor being the University of St. Francis over in Fort Wayne, Indiana. They had I think it was a 2-day conference on Dorothy Day and the church. And they had all kinds of papers, some kind of scholarly, some were informal. And the dean over there called me up and said, we don't have a publishing operation here at the university, but I see that you guys seem to like Dorothy Day. Could you get this thing into print for us? And I said, yeah, that'd be great. So we basically, just kind of designed a cover and put it together. But it drew us all into a greater interest in Dorothy, the Catholic worker movement, Peter Morin. So that was kind of working in the background. And then we started up a podcast. I got contacted by a young guy named Pete Davis, who read some of our stuff and was a Dorothy Day fan and was a law student out east, but knew about podcasting. And he said, let's just call up some of our friends and we'll call it Dorothy's Place. And sort of like we're hanging out in her kitchen. And so we've done, I think, maybe 6 or 8 episodes now and hope to do more of that. But again, mostly on themes of kind of social renewal, radical hospitality, and kind of related ideas of community building.
Okay, so have you ever you've done a lot of writing and so forth, but have you come to the point where you want to get any of these ideas into practice?
Yeah, definitely. And we've been thinking that for a while, even before the election of this guy that I refer to as the incumbent, the present occupant. Yeah. We were thinking, yes, we needed to put these ideas on the road. Now, how to do that? We thought, well, we need to come up with a kind of a toolbox for people out there like us that like working on community projects. And as we were looking around for models, I came across this thing over in Detroit called Detroit Soup. And in a nutshell, this is an event whereby people in the neighborhood all meet up at, say a big warehouse or something, and you kind of sit on a cushion on the floor after paying $5 at the door to get in. And then the dinner is a bowl of soup, a piece of bread, bottle of water, and the event is called, therefore, a soup. So what happens at a soup? Well, about 4 people get up as you're having the meal, and they each pitch an idea for the neighborhood. Can be really anything, an arts idea, a little business, after-school program, a new organization. And they've been doing this in Detroit for now, I think, 7 or 8 years. They have just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ideas, maybe into the thousands now, that people have pitched. They have raised something close to $150,000, $5 at a time. They have started businesses. They've started nonprofits. They've started all kinds of programs. They've had a bunch of ideas that didn't work. And so we thought, well, this is like the really grassroots way to do sort of a Shark Tank, except you don't have the nitwits. You have just the neighborhood people.
So you mean I can't participate?
There's another word they use for the Shark Tank personalities, but I can't use it on the radio. Not on television.
The Shark Tank personalities. I see. I just
those guys.
I focused on the nitwit, and I just immediately
no. We're guys in the shark skin suits.
I get it.
Those guys, venture capital guys. No, this is all neighborhood stuff. So if you win, if you're one of the 4 ideas, and you pitch really well and you win, you walk away, on the spot with maybe $300, $500 for your idea. So you get instant startup cash. But the truth is, that's not why people do community micro-funding dinners. The reason you do it is because after you do your pitch, typically several people will come up and say, Jack, that was an amazing idea, man. How'd you come up with that? Can I volunteer to help you? So what you're talking about doing here is building social capital and connections. And the real way to grow your idea is finding, 3 or 4 other people that like it and are willing to volunteer and help you make it work. So that's what a soup is. So we did one over in Michigan City, Indiana, and we did one in Gary, Indiana, and we raised some money and we heard some great ideas, and we learned something, which is that soups are great, but you probably need a next step. You probably need some kind of an incubator to take the soup ideas and sit down and talk about how to really make them successful. Detroit, as far as I know, does not have really a process to do that, at least not tied to the soup program itself. But I think that's something that we were interested in. And if we go forward with these soup dinners, we'll look at creating some kind of a little incubator to help give them some sustainability.
Well, I guess that's kind of what I was thinking about as you were describing all of this. It sounds great, people getting together and talking about these ideas, but in the type of society that we live in, one needs to get money, and and this is, these things, there can be, as we've seen, a ground up type of movement, but at the end of the day, in order for things to enter into commerce, there's going to have to be some kind of financial backing. And I would say that if you are indeed trying to come up with distributist ideas, then there are going to be perhaps more people willing to spend money against you than to help. And that's that. Have you encountered that kind of a challenge yet, or is it still too early for that sort of thing?
Well, it may be a little bit early because, truthfully, most of the ideas we heard about sounded more like community service. They were not really for-profit businesses. As you might imagine, those are relatively rare, difficult to do, under the best of conditions, but not impossible. And I think, small businesses, which is what we're talking about here, that would be a very interesting way to go. Maybe part of what we need to think about in this next version of the soups is a way to consider whether these new businesses might be cooperatives. And it'd be interesting to have a little training program, a school, so that you could think about how to take a great business idea, but, distribute the ownership. If it's a new idea, that's one thing. You could also take, aside from the soups, you could take a business that is already operating where the owner is about to retire. And rather than just selling it off, sometimes an owner will, if they understand the process, convert it to a co-op. I don't know anybody in this area that's quite done that, but in other parts of the country, there are a lot of people buzzing about that because it is a very Catholic thing to do. And so several recent popes, certainly including
Absolutely,
Pope
it's
Francis,
Catholic because it goes back to Leo the 13th.
Yeah.
And his encyclical Rerum Novarum, and he said that it would be a good thing if more people were owners. What a coincidence! That's exactly what the distributists, said after him.
That's right.
But that's what, and in fact, distributism as a movement, as a concept, really derived from Leo the 13th.
Yep.
And Rerum Novarum, and then later Quadragesimo Anno by Pius the 11th. So and that's it. It seems to me that if you're going to have a distributist idea, that eventually the rubber's going to have to hit the road, and there's going to have to be distributist businesses. Yeah. And there could be two ways this could be gone about. Now, the fact of the matter is that a great many people already pretty much work for themselves, and they just work by themselves. Now, that's about as distributist as you can get. But on the other hand, there is such a thing as socialized production, and there is such a thing as business reach and so on that requires more people. And the challenge is going to be to get us from the model that we currently have to wit two classes of people, owners and workers, and move it over into which those people are the same. And and to do it in a manner that is not, I guess, for lack of a better term, socialistic or revolutionary in the sense of having a class war, but to do it in a manner in which the classes blend together and everybody ends up having the same interests. Yeah. So there's no more contradiction within the economy, and that's that to me. Now I'm not Mr. Distributist or anything, and we just had John Madai here on last week, and so he's one of the foremost voices of distributism today. But when I think of distributism, that is the sort of thing that comes to my mind. In other words, to actually come up with programs to distribute ownership. It would be nice, however, if there was a way to affect legislation, but there are unfortunately sometimes people that are distributist in orientation are a little wary to wade into those rather corrupt waters, which is power grabbing and so forth. And I wonder if you have any observations about that.
Well, I mean, certainly there is that. And you know what? There's another dimension to this that, in fact, even Belloc remarked on, and that is it is something about the modern kind of wage economy. You can't assume that every worker is thrilled at the idea of being an owner. There are people that when they find out, for example, to be part of a cooperative business and to be a co-owner means you also have to know a certain amount of stuff to make a contribution as a co-owner. So you have to get really involved in kind of understanding the books and the operations and, to be a little bit interchangeable and kind of move back and forth from one role to the other. So there's a learning curve. It's a cultural thing, and it's not a small matter. And I take it that part of the challenge in the cooperative movements around the world today is to try to work on the psychology of people that are tempted to say, look, I just want $20 an hour and go home. Can't I just do that? No, that really isn't what we're trying to do here. So that's a challenge, and it requires kind of an esprit de corps. That's the way Mondragon did it. Mondragon was a very tight-knit, sort of ethnically similar group of people that generation after generation just had a real kind of team mentality about what they were doing. And it's not a simple thing to recreate. Likewise, in northern Italy, around Ferrara, Milan, and those areas where all the cooperative activity is going on today, they have a certain kind of labor history, kind of a solidarity around there. This is the kind of fancy manufacturing, Ferrari neighborhood, that kind of thing, Fiat, and so on. So if you don't have that, which really we don't, given the state of unions today and so on, you're going to have to rebuild it. And that's going to take quite a while, a lot of trust, and a lot of patience. So that's just unfortunately where we are.
Yeah, I can see that because, I think it just, I think what happened in essence is that we've been hitting ourselves in the head for so long, it started to feel good.
True.
Yeah, True. That division in society, that division in the economy, got us to the point where so many we become just loose atoms moving about. That I just want to go in and I don't really owe anything to this company other than the labor, the work that I've already agreed upon, and then I can just book out of there at 5 o'clock, and I don't have to think about it until tomorrow morning. And that's, but that in the long run doesn't make people very happy, does it? Because they spend 8 to 10 hours of their day doing something that on some level they actually loathe. And,
right.
and that's go ahead.
Imagine working at a place like Mondragon, where until the 2008 recession, at which point they were over 50 years old, as a collection of cooperatives, they had never laid off an employee. They were up to maybe at that point the I think the fifth or sixth largest industrial enterprise in Spain, and they had never laid off an employee. So how could they do that? The answer was because they were so entrepreneurial and agile as a company that when they needed to move somebody, when a particular co-op is not doing well, and so they would close it down. They were constantly starting and closing things. They actually created their own bank, which is, by the way, a pretty key piece of the puzzle with Mondragon. If you got your own financing, you're on a whole different planet. But when they had to shut something down, they would take everybody and work it out and just move them to a different cooperative. So it was really sometime after 2008 when they had a particularly bad kind of wrench in some part of the system, and they did finally have to lay some people off, given the severity of the downturn. But their record on that was just off the charts, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that everybody that worked there just had this mentality. Nobody gets thrown overboard. Not unless you've really done something terrible and crime or something. But if it's just an economic thing, we will fix it. We'll plug you in someplace else. Don't worry about it.
Yes, and when we have cooperatives in the United States, has there ever been a study as to whether or not they have established that level of togetherness and how it came about?
No, I don't think worldwide there's more than one Mondragon. Mondragon got up to $12 billion in revenue a year. So you're talking about the largest industrial cooperative enterprise ever created.
I meant there are cooperatives, obviously smaller ones.
Yeah.
But there are cooperatives in the United States. Some of them have managed to last a while, and I just wonder, have they managed to establish that core spirit and that sense of loyalty to one another? And has there ever been anyone take a look at how they accomplished that, notwithstanding we have such an atomistic society in which to operate?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wonder if probably some sociologist or business prof might have taken a look at that, because there's a fair number of them. The city of New York has been actively promoting them in the last 2 or 3 years. And I really think, actually, since there's almost no other way to do it other than by creating this kind of group spirit, there probably are some guidelines, there's some history, there may be some case studies in how this is getting done. Not surprisingly, one of the largest in New York is a home health care service, which is nothing but minority women, many of whom live in the Bronx. But you're talking about, I forget the numbers here, but I think it might be several thousand members of a healthcare co-op. And it's a big system. They've got a platform, and they're all, very, very loyal and tied into the thing. So I think the scale is increasing as people find out more and more what are the benefits of belonging to an organization that is so committed to the worker owners. Very unusual, kind of situation.
It just occurs to me that at some point is the concept is introduced into the wider society. I mean, co-ops are started with the idea of the workers are going to be the owners, okay, and they start with that concept. But how about General Motors? How are we going to transform that? And so this is there's a lot of large companies in that sense. We have employee stock ownership plans, which largely operate as retirement plans for the most part. But it seems to me that something like that could be developed and encouraged, say, with tax incentives, and employees would get stock. It wouldn't go into a trust or anything. It would just be issued directly to the employees who earned them, and this would gradually transform it. You wouldn't have to rise up and with a sickle and whatever. What was the communist symbol? There was a sickle, hammer and sickle.
Hammer and sickle, yeah.
Hammer and sickle. That's okay. See, I've been accused of never doing a lick of work.
Quickly we forget.
Yes, that's right. And what the point is you wouldn't have to just put all the capitalists in a re-education camp. The idea would be to sure, we need capital. This is like I was just reading Quadragesimo Anno the other day, and he says, well, capital and labor work together, and so you could actually bring those things together, working in concert rather than as now opposed to one another. Yeah. And this could gradually be brought about as shares are issued. This is obviously in the context of a large corporation to the employees, according to a fixed formula.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, and it's hard to think of a better ideal than the kind of the Mondragon experience, capital and labor are in a sense kind of interchangeable. They permeate each other. There just isn't this kind of standoff and the idea of opposing interests. So if you can get past that, then it's just a very different way of operating. So, but very difficult to do. Very difficult to do.
Right. Well, it's at some point it's going to have to be the answer. I mean, if working people are not organized, and fewer of them are, then those who are in the labor market are going to increasingly find themselves, just like employees, working people did in the of Leo the 13th. They're basically going to be confronting employment on a take it or leave it basis, and we're already seeing the impact of that. I mean, we haven't had such income disparity as we have now since since just before the Great Depression, which is somewhat alarming. And it seems that we've lost the lessons of that. We can't really say that all of the reforms that took place after that, which have now been tossed out the window, were in any sense distributist, or, I suppose you could say organization of labor is on a certain level distributist in the sense that as people make more money, they can set some aside and buy some productive property themselves. That was Leo the 13th's idea. Mm-hmm. But obviously it didn't go full blown into trying to get more and more people invested into capital ownership themselves. And in point of fact, it turns out that labor unions themselves were somewhat suspicious of that notion early on.
Yeah, true.
True. And so what's the future? I noticed that you are firing up the Solidarity Hall blog again.
Right.
What do you got in mind?
Well, there's a little bridge to that, and that is in terms of the future, where we could go with these ideas. One thing I notice is that it's likely that the term distributism may kind of drop out or continue to be a slightly mysterious notion, because I think I'm hearing a lot more about, cooperativism, sometimes something called the civil economy, which has to do with sometimes called the sharing economy, not Airbnb and Uber, but rather what Benedict was talking about in Caritas and Veritate. The economics behind Caritas and Veritate come out of, in particular, two Italian economists, Zamagni and, I forget the other guy's name, who are working on a recovery of something called the civil economy, which is a rather like a cousin to distributism in a way. And then in New York, there's a group of people that are working on taking these ideas into the digital realm, and therefore we now have the rise of something called platform cooperativism. And here's the funny thing. I want to mention a young guy, Nathan Schneider, is about to publish a book, and it is called Everything for Everyone: The Radical Tradition That Is Shaping the Next Economy. And what he's talking about is the economy where there is real sharing, not the phony kind. And so what's happening is, if you are a digital worker and you sign up to be part of a platform, you're no longer creating digital content and then handing it off, working, whatever hours the platform demands, with no benefits and no ownership of that data, that content you just created. Instead, you are a co-owner. And the people behind this, it's a movement, a small movement, mostly in New York. They've been holding some conferences the last 2 or 3 years. They are deliberately knocking off a kind of a distributist approach. If you read a book by a guy named Douglas Rushkoff called Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus, it is a kind of a complaint about our technocratic, financialized economy, particularly in the digital sense. And what's really striking about this guy, he is a secular Jewish intellectual teaching, I think, at NYU. And he gets to the last chapter of the book, and he says, what we need to make this new digital economy really fair and equitable and community building is we need to recover Catholic social teachings. Now, imagine how I fell over reading that. And he goes through the concepts. He goes through subsidiarity, and he goes through solidarity, and he goes through a just wage and all the rest of it. And he says, look, I'm not a Catholic. I like Pope Francis, and I've been doing some reading, and damned if it doesn't look like these guys had it figured out back in the Middle Ages, and then we dropped the ball. So he's saying, let's take working models wherever we can find them. If we have to go back 700 or 800 years, fine, because what we're doing right now is not working. We're going to have a new vision, and it looks like one of the greatest visions we could have, where there really was a sense of real equity in the economy, is the one that is described and captured in the terms of Catholic social teachings, which I think is kind of an amazing thing. So those ideas are out there. You don't even have to make a special pitch for them. They are being kind of retailed by people that don't particularly care where they came from. The truth is, Jack, I think they find in them a deep humanism. And I don't think either of us would deny that that is a component of Catholic social thought, even if you extract, the theological connections. It's true that you can't really quite grasp everything about Catholic social teachings, I think, unless you get sort of the whole picture, the way everything fits together. But in a more limited way, there clearly is a kind of a vision of a just society that you can extract, even if you feel that these writings are simply the deepest kind of humanism, genuine humanism that you can find.
Well, I can't argue with that. Now, there's one thing that you were saying a moment ago, and you were talking about people who are working on platforms getting ownership in that. And when you said that, I was reminded of something. I occasionally annoy people with with this, but because I keep bringing up the fact that Leo the 13th actually had a labor theory of property. It wasn't exactly John Locke's labor theory of property. He didn't feel like he needed to argue that something of the person gets metaphysically transformed into the land he works or anything like that. But it was the starting point for him, and thereafter for all of Catholic social teaching about property being an actual right. Okay, in other words, it's not simply a social convention. And what strikes me about that is that, well, first of all, it makes so much sense because the only other way to acquire property is through violence, really. I mean, in a primitive setting, but and we could talk about that. But the fact is that we have a system whereby labor and ownership are separated and divorced in such a way that it just might be creating an imbalance in the economy. And just to let the stark reality set in, if I go to a job, then I will be paid money, which represents an abstraction of my labor. Would you say that's a fair statement? All right. So I take that. Now I can go and buy shares of stock with that money if I'm making enough. Okay. If conversely, if I'm working for a company, I can't necessarily get shares in the company just simply by working for it.
Right.
So here we have what seems to me an essential absurdity, to wit, that I can purchase stock with an abstraction of my money, an abstraction of my labor, but I can't buy it with the labor itself. Yep. And that I think
seems almost by design, doesn't
it? It might be by design. I don't know if there was a cabal.
I'll pay you just enough, Jack, just enough, but not too much.
Well, there was a cabal. Obviously, just human nature was such that people wanted to pay their labor as little as possible, because labor becomes a cost, a commodity in that situation. But what I'm trying to drive at is that there seems to be a contradiction or a kind of absurdity in the idea that you can purchase ownership through the abstraction of labor, but you cannot purchase ownership through labor.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yep, yep.
as that, and there just might be some kernel of I was going to say kernel of truth, but that sounds too trite. Kernel of reality, in that might give us a key into understanding where the contradictions in our particular economic configuration arise. It just, it's one of those, those dim thoughts that move around through my head as I try and find my way to the front door. But it's, there's been obviously now a lot of people come up with ideas similar to this, and kids today they some of them are calling themselves socialists now. When they're now that term has gotten to be, I don't know, in my judgment, almost meaningless.
Right, because, I agree.
Yeah, because it addresses so many things. I mean, Bernie Sanders called himself a democratic socialist, but all he really was a New Deal Democrat.
Exactly.
And the term is just getting used in so many different ways now. When somebody tells me that they're a socialist or a democratic socialist, I'm compelled to ask them what they mean by it, and sometimes I even get a clear answer. But but you actually went to a function the other day and wrote an article about it.
I did.
And you let's see, where is he? Didn't you? I don't have it up because I don't have sense enough to actually to do that, because now it's going to take me forever. But why don't you tell us what you went to and how you experienced it?
Well, I was thinking the other day, I'd been reading about this young woman out in the Bronx, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she kind of came out of nowhere, and she upset this establishment Democrat in the primary, and she appeared to be a very charismatic and thoughtful young woman, and really kind of obviously a rising star is really, I think, everybody's thought. And I read that she was a democratic socialist and so on. And I thought, that's interesting. And then, reading a little further, I discover she's a practicing Catholic. And I thought, wow, now that is getting interesting, because she's maybe, I don't know what she is, maybe 30. I'm not quite sure how old she is. But anyway, it's an interesting sign that in her generation, she has put together these two things with no difficulty whatever. And then I began to reflect, if you look at the people that we write about in Solidarity Hall, not only, Dorothy Day and Peter Moran, but also, E.F. Schumacher, Wendell Berry, Jane Jacobs, you could, Cornel West, you could come up with quite a list of people. And if you had to, in terms of describing what is their political affiliation, what's their similarity in terms of their politics, I realized they were all roughly in some way Christian socialists, which is a kind of an animal that you just don't think exists. But of course it does. And always, it goes back a long way. I mean, if you want, all the way back to the New Testament.
Well, Pius XI said that it couldn't exist.
Yeah, right. But although we know he was talking about a very specific flavor, wasn't he? Right? He was talking about a certain kind of scary militant thing that he may well have. I don't know if he confused it with communism, but he very likely he was being a little alarmist about probably one or two groups he was thinking of.
Well, he acknowledged that there were two different things by that time.
Yeah,
socialists had branched off into communists, and then the more benign form, but he also objected to the essential materialism of it.
Yes, right. So if you're going to be a Christian socialist, then you're going to be a hybrid who is taking elements of socialistic theory and, let's say, just revising it a bit, which is really the whole idea. I mean, So I thought about this, and I thought, I hear there's a lot of rumbling about this. I certainly agree with you that this term has become more or less meaningless because, after all, I think one trait of many younger people today is they just have no sense of history whatsoever, which in a way is liberating. They are unburdened with some of the more, paranoid kind of elements around this term that maybe us older types might have grown up with. So I thought, well, how would I find out more about this? And I noticed there was a conference in Chicago, I think it was a 4-day conference altogether, just a couple of weeks ago, up at a nice hotel next to McCormick Place. And I thought, I will call these guys up and I will impersonate a journalist. And let's see if I can wangle a press pass and get in there and just hang out for 2 or 3 days and see if I can figure out, what's with these people. And so I got the press pass and I went and hung out, and I had a very interesting time. I discovered that I was hanging out with a particular type of socialist, more or less, given that the thing was sponsored by the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, which is a Marxist-inspired organization. They are not communists. They're not in the slightest totalitarian, but they do have a certain tradition which is fairly much focused on the politics of a worker-led revolution that really does not contemplate much in the way of other approaches or other theories about how society could be reformed or rearranged. So it was fascinating. There was a lot of history going on. It was like a big teach-in from the 60s. So there were many conferences, many workshops on various revolutions, the Portuguese Revolution of 1974, the German Revolution of 1918 to 1923. There was a lot of sort of post-mortem stuff trying to figure out, do we understand what happened here? Why didn't it work? What do we need to do? As well as, a lot of sort of political identity stuff, identity politics, understandably. Stuff on the environment, stuff on what else? I don't know, a little bit on the history of Marxism, Engels, Trotsky, some of those, Gramsci was a figure. So it had kind of an odd sort of nostalgic twist in one way. What I did not find, by the way, and I mentioned this in the article, I did not find very much in the way of conversation about new systems, new approaches. How exactly would we rearrange the root causes of our problems in terms of the economics and so on? Not much of that. And there's certainly, and maybe I should have expected this, but there was really no awareness or interest in any kind of a faith-based approach. So in terms of, maybe Martin Luther King's faith, in terms of the Catholic worker traditions, in terms of the anti-war traditions of the Mennonites and the Anabaptists, nothing, not a word, never came up. So that was interesting.
Well, that's to be expected, is it not? I mean,
I guess so.
The left in that sense has just always been anti-religion. That goes back to the French Revolution. I mean,
mostly. That's right. Yeah. That's right. So, and yet, here's something interesting. Because someone pointed this out to me after I published the article. The Democratic Socialists of America have an honorary chairman, and that is Cornel West. So I suddenly realized, this is probably, the group whose conference I was looking for, because I know a bit about West and read a bit of his stuff. And this is also the party of Ocasio-Cortez and people like that. So my guess is they are a much more, sort of personalistic, ecumenical kind of group. And if I go to another one of these, I will try to find the DSA conference next time around.
Well, they certainly seem to be the ones that have the most currency. It is an issue that I've written about a couple times,
Uh-huh.
and something that, really deserves more examination to find out, because you're right. Someone from my generation, I hear the word socialism, and how many times have I heard, I'm a communist, I'm a socialist, and I say, well, Pol Pot kind of ruined it for me, and they say and then they say, no, I'm not that kind.
Okay.
Right? And I say, well, what about Stalin and this and that, and what about what about what Chairman Mao did, and they say, well, that wasn't really communism, and so basically.
Right.
Basically, they resort to the no true Scotsman fallacy. But
there are strangely defenders of Stalin running around the world. There were none, as far as I know, there were none at this conference, and there's no one at the conference who attempted to offer any apologetic for Pol Pot or Mao or any of those guys. You don't hear that. You don't hear that.
Yeah.
What they do have, which is kind of interesting, they do have a very, very deep, abiding confidence in the ability of the working class to organize themselves and get it done in a way that, in a sense, sort of reminds you of certain kinds of anarchism. And this is the part that sort of interests me. I'm now talking about, if there is such a thing, kind of the constructive kind of anarchism, not the violent kind, but the idea that, society ought to be self-organizing, that we don't need these institutions as badly as we think anyway. And so if we could realize that organizing our neighborhoods and our towns and our regions could get us a long way, then I don't think that turns into Chairman Mao. That turns into certain wonderful moments, like in the Spanish Civil War. There were some anarcho-syndicalists that evidently did some amazing things. Over in Kurdistan, Rojava, that region has really been kind of an anarchist, political organization that's risen up, that's probably going to get destroyed by the Turkish army. But very influenced by Murray Bookchin and other anarchist thinkers. So this has got a kind of an Occupy flavor. But that's not what was going on in Chicago among the kind of the old-time socialists, even though some of them were quite young, the ones I was hanging out with. But I think that is a more interesting, school of thought around these things.
It's an idea. Noam Chomsky is something along those lines.
That's exactly right.
And listen, I got a lot of respect for that, but there's one fallacy that I perceive in that thinking, and that is that I think that societies are self-organizing.
Yes.
Not okay. We there's no point in which we step outside of nature.
Good point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Even though, and so whatever flavor of a political organization you have, it is a natural event. And the fact is that if you eliminate government tomorrow, the first guy that grabs the gun is going to be the government.
That's
and that's just and so we have to give conscious attention to how we're going to let how we're going to have our gun distribution. According.
Yeah.
And I mean,
that little matter.
You do. You remember the good, the bad, and the ugly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the guy, the Clint Eastwood character, he's there's that. Remember that three-way standoff at the end, and there's gold buried, right? And then one guy dies, and there's out that there's another guy left alive, and I won't get into all the details because we're running out of time. But anyway, it turns out that the Clint Eastwood character had tricked the other guy by unloading his gun, so he only had to worry about the guy who is now dead, right? And the guy says, "Well, I could have been killed." No, that wasn't going to happen because I knew your gun was unloaded. I didn't have to worry about you, right? and then now the question becomes, who gets the gold and how this is going to work. And then Clint Eastwood says there's two kinds of people in this world: those whose guns are loaded and those who dig.
Ooh. Yeah. That's it. That's it.
And I saw that, and I said, "This is a statement of all geopolitical reality."
Yes, that's right.
It is now 10:29. We got to get going. Elias, quickly give us
All right.
your website.
Yeah. We are solidarityhall.org.
All right, and so
All
we
one
are.
word. Yep.
That's good. And so we are. Let me see. We got about 25 seconds, and go check out solidarityhall.org. Some of the best writing out there that you're going to find. Look at the. Check out Christian Democracy at the Pathos blog, and all the as well as the other fine shows on WCAT Internet Radio. And well, that's about it, everyone. Good night.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.